Hello, can you hear me now? Perfect. Hi there. I'm Tom Donachie from Amro Partners, and I'm going to be moderating the session today. Thanks for joining us. I think it's going to be a really exciting panel. The subject kind of backdrop really is sort of achieving net zero, and really it's about discussing, overcoming any disconnect between capital, so funders, design, pulling that through, and also operators. Before we go into the subject, I'd like to introduce the panel. So perhaps Sam, pass over to you first, if that's okay.
Yep, so I'm Sam Winard, so I work for Pension Insurance Corporation and I head up the operational side of Build to Rent.
Hi, I'm Polly Simpson. I'm Head of Multifamily Development at Savills, advising both investors and developers in securing capital, but also on the consultancy basis of what Build to Rent should look like.
Hello, I'm Simon Bayliss, Managing Partner of HDA Design. We're architects, landscape architects and designers in the housing sector, focusing quite a lot on build to rent at the moment.
Perfect, thanks everyone. So I guess starting point, capital design operation, let's start at the beginning of that in terms of the process, and that's really focusing on the capital. So I guess probably question for you, Polly, to start with, and given your kind of holistic view of that capital market, how important is, creating energy efficient building and in-use carbon for sort of the capital funders?
Yeah, I think that it's an incredibly important thing, and something over the last 10 years that's become very much at the forefront of what capital is seeking to deploy into. And ticking off ESG boxes was kind of a process to get through, I see, and now it's become very much a moral obligation on investors who are thinking a bit more longer term than maybe original or developers were at the very beginning or onset of the sector. We've definitely seen an uptick in the number of capital partners who are looking to pay financially to improve the green credentials of a building, which I think is a great facet of this industry that we don't necessarily see or you haven't seen to the same extent in some other forms of housing delivery.
Okay, perfect. And then probably pass to you, Sam. As a funder yourself, with perhaps more kind of in-use carbon and managing that, how important is that for Pension Insurance Corporation, and how are you managing that?
Yeah, I think to Polly's point, it's become more than a tick box exercise, and where we're long-term holders, then obviously there's longer-term benefits to us taking that sort of approach to ESG as well. But I think equally, where we're going to be owner-operators, it's kind of the squeezes from two sides. So there's demand from residents. Given the type of demographic we're hitting, they're much more ESG conscious. Obviously, there's the climate at the moment means that, and from the energy point of view, there's a lot more focus on that side of things. So there's a squeeze from both ends. There's the investor, and then there's the residents themselves demanding, and I think that all feeds into making the wheels turn.
Yeah, fine. And then Simon, we'll probably come back to you shortly on design, but you sort of mentioned then, box tick exercise, and that's probably from a creating energy efficient buildings. What are those boxes? What does capital look for in terms of it's got to hit these certain thresholds in order for us to invest, or is it more sort of nascent than that?
Well, I mean, that's the difficulty. So talking to new entrants and global investors into the UK at the moment, and they're looking for what can they say is what accreditations are out there that really does support the green credentials of the building. And historically, we've relied on hitting a certain.
Excuse me. Can we turn up the mic or? Very quiet.
I'll get the karaoke mic. Yeah. So, thank you very much. Is that? Oh, that's better. There we go. There we go. Perfect. Speaking to new investors and asking about what accreditations are out there to support their green credentials of buildings, and it is quite difficult. I think we've got a few: BREEAM, EPCs, HQM, and a few other some that are local and some that are international, and that can help. Albeit that for build to rent, there are a few other things that just aren't captured there, and so the ESG becomes a whole myriad of different explanations and things that we can demonstrate through the building. And I think the point about tenant demand is really important, because they're starting to hold each other accountable and
Mhm.
saying, "Oh, you live in an EPC rated C building," and
Yeah.
which is really important. And I think that is starting to attract or capture the minds of capital. And Savills Research did a recent study to look at what tenants and homeowners are willing to pay as an uplift premium for green credentials of an asset. And it's there, and it's starting to become more pronounced.
Mhm.
And so I don't think capital is chasing that premium, but it's definitely aligned with it.
Yeah, and then Simon, I guess sticking on capital, are you seeing, you know, a drive from whether it's funders or developers in terms of pushing you to ensure that your design hits certain thresholds, or, you know, just a general movement towards more energy efficient?
Absolutely. I mean, it's so refreshing, the customer push for a practice that's worked for 50 years and for 40 of those years trying to push house builders and other developers towards, you know, a more efficient energy efficient building, just because it feels like the right thing to do. It feels like a sensible thing to do, regardless of climate change as it was at the time, not perhaps so significant, but it just felt like a sensible thing to do. To go from that place where as architects we're constantly pushing to try and get there, and as the designers in the UK, I think still the largest zero carbon community in Bristol, it's only there because policy forced the developer to do it. You know, it was a government pilot, and it was the only one that was built. So to come now into a sector which actually is sort of, you know, demanding it and saying to the designers, you know, can you do this? How can you do it better? Can you do it more cost effectively? You know, can you do it in terms of embodied carbon but also reduced energy? Can you do it quicker? And then when the building is complete, will it cost less energy to run? And the fact that it's, you know, it's driven by perhaps capital because they need to sort of move the asset on, but it's also driven by the customers because the two are connected, means that for once everybody appears to be pushing in one direction.
And rarely does that happen.
Rarely, never. So yes, so sorry, that's the precursor bit. What does that mean? It means that we are being challenged by clients to find new ways to deliver, you know, better, to deliver more efficient, to reduce carbon. What's really interesting is those solutions are already out there. You know, we can solve the problem already. There are costs attached to that, but the more we work together, the more we can kind of find ways to drive those costs down and ensure that, you know, we get the right outcome.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a clear sort of momentum and drive to kind of get to a much better position. We mentioned, I mean, capital seems to be on board, you know, design seems to be moving, residents want it. Why do you think maybe we're not quite there yet? What is preventing us? Do you think is it cost? Is it something else?
Definitely cost.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to compete in every area of your development. You know, you have to purchase the land. Obviously, that's highly competitive. Perhaps slightly less competitive in the next 6 months. We might see a benefit there. But of course, the build costs have been going through the roof, and adding on anything that has an additional premium is going to make you less competitive, potentially impact on your rents, which is going to impact on your customers. So yes, it has to be considered within that sort of appraisal context. But I think if you're looking at it for the long term, you know, those house builders that we were dealing with, selling their house, walking away, had nothing to do with it. You know, in 10, 15 years' time, how are you going to feel about an asset that was built on the cusp of a big change, and you left it, you know, in the previous standard, in the old ways, and no one wants to take that asset on for its next iteration of life cycle? So I think there's probably quite a lot of pressure on all of us to make sure we don't deliver anything that's kind of left behind.
Yeah, and I guess Sam, from you, do you sort of concur with that message from Simon?
Yeah, absolutely. I think even some of the more granular things now are coming into decision making when we come to ESG. So, you know, looking at recycled plastic in blinds, you know, it's things we probably wouldn't have considered 2 or 3 years ago, but now actually there's value in us making that decision. The cost is actually not significantly different to alternatives. I think the world's moved on significantly, and actually I think the way I look at it is there is value in all of those small things for residents, and it's about knitting that story together to tell them the story of what's gone into a building. Because I think the other thing we see is that there's a lot of work that's done up front, and where there can be that disconnect is then communicating that to residents in terms of what's been done within the building for their benefit essentially, and environmentally for the benefit. So part of the process as well is communicating that value to them throughout the process.
Okay, and I'm probably going back to Simon. I mean, you mentioned kind of, you know, can good design really create high energy performance buildings?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, is it reliant on the operator? Somewhat. How do you bridge that gap then? How?
Well, I mean, there's sort of simple passive things that, you know, we've been working with daylight and sunlight standards for quite some time now. We have really sophisticated models that we can use to drive the design of the building. Historically, we would design the building, pass it to somebody to, you know, do the assessment and then be told where it wasn't working. Now we use that at the beginning of the design process, so we use it to kind of understand perhaps the environmentals of the particular site, neighbours, overshadowing and all the other things, and we can drive a design solution that you know, responds to that. Increasingly, we're seeing that flip to a challenge of overheating. So, but the two are obviously very closely connected. You need big windows for lovely daylight and sunlight and healthy spaces, but you need to minimise the overheating from those windows, so overshadowing, higher sills, all of those sorts of features. So we've moved away, I think, from an architecture which is perhaps slightly whimsical, made up of a design idea that's driven a little bit more by some of these environmental factors. That gives you other, you know, constraints to work with, which are fascinating, but it actually reduces things, load on plant, all of that kind of thing that is very costly. Mm-hmm. So there's really good design tools that we can use to try and get it right from the very beginning.
Yeah, and then Sam, I guess, sort of moving from the beginning and then over to the operator. You know, how are you finding that sort of transfer of information and other things that you're kind of implementing to make that easier?
Yeah, well, I think the interesting thing is obviously 20% of the energy, circa 20% of the energy that's used within a building is the communal supply, 80% is the resident supply. So again, you know, there are lots of things we can do to improve the efficiency of the building from a landlord running perspective and from the perspective of tenants. But then again, the big challenge for us is about picking up that baton and saying, okay, we've designed a building in a certain way, but then how you operate the building, how you allow or how residents engage with the building is really important to actually make use and benefit from all of the effort that's made up front. So what we're keen on doing is making sure that we engage with residents. There's lots of talk about gamifying utility usage at the moment, and we're fully on board with that, trying to make it more interesting and raise awareness of utilities. Obviously, it is in the news a lot at the moment, so people are very aware of it. But then piggybacking on that and really running with it as much as possible.
Yeah, okay, makes sense. And then on the subject of utilities, obviously hot subject at the moment. From a capital perspective, Polly, is utilities being, you know, debated in terms of OPEX, or, you know, has it kind of been blown over? How much has that impacted capital decision at the moment?
It's a mixed bag, I would say. Utilities and the cost of utilities is definitely something which is featuring in investment decisions, but obviously in the build to rent world, which is slightly different from PBSA, they're not inclusive in the rents. So there's a bit more disbursement across all the stakeholders of the building as to how that's impacting. Notwithstanding that, the general operation of the building, the functioning of back of house and communal spaces is definitely a concern for investors.
And with that, you kind of mentioned then, I mean, build to rent, obviously, standard practices, rent, utilities excluded. Mm-hmm. If there's the creation of more energy efficient buildings, therefore utilities coming down, do you see that as value being passed to the resident? Is that value being passed to capital? Do we see a model that comes forward with inclusive rents because the building is more efficient? How do you see that sort of evolving?
I definitely think that everybody who's taking the risk at the moment should benefit from any upside, and that's probably like the likelihood or the likely way that it will progress. I don't see a way. Well, I don't see a moral way that the investor could suddenly take all control and benefit from any savings that are made from energy efficient buildings. But I think that collectively and you know, the pressures on that cost is probably driving our investment or exploration of more energy efficient or cheaper costs, so that can be passed on to everybody.
Fine, and then Simon, kind of question off the back of that for you, which is how can design, you know, if capital and developers are coming to you, how would you advise design can help reduce that sort of energy efficiency or in-use energy?
Well, I've talked a bit about, I suppose, spatial configurations and environmental factors like daylight and sunlight. There's then, I suppose, a whole bigger story around construction materials and specification. We have a huge problem in the UK industry at the moment in terms of lack of clarity on regulation. combustibility of materials. They tend to come at a very high carbon, brick and terracotta, they have a very long life span, which is fantastic, and they're non-combustible, but they do have a very high carbon content, if you like, or footprint. So getting that balance in check is incredibly important, sort of lightweight versus heavyweight, thermal mass that can soak up some of that residual heat that's coming in, and also being able to disperse it. Some of the challenges around really dogmatic views in policy around dual aspect, obsession with a number of dual aspect homes, which becomes a kind of, you need to hit the right percentage regardless of how good quality you're achieving in the homes. It's almost become, the quality's become a sort of secondary factor so long as you hit 75, 80, whatever percentage it is. So we've got a role to play, I think, in challenging some of those policy orthodoxies that have crept in, but we also have a role in terms of material specification. We've done a lot of work in modular construction as one of our areas, and we've done a lot of studying with universities that have shown potential reduction in carbon of up to 40%, even more in some cases, and that obviously comes with an attendant energy reduction as well. So I think we have to look at both sides. We have to look at how we design a building to be delivered with a lower amounts of embodied carbon and energy that then go on to perform well in use as well.
Yeah, and that's very consistent with. Is this working again? No. Hello.
Just have to shout.
Yeah. I've tried it
Try
on and off
again.
again if anyone might see something. I'm cursed, sorry. Hello? No. Is that one?
No.
No more from me today.
Well, that gets fixed. I guess,
Yeah.
Simon, we just jump into you. You sort of mentioned policy then, and the restrictions that perhaps puts on bringing forward these types of buildings. How do we overcome that?
We sort of try to demonstrate through, qualitative presentations, and we try to influence policy by preparing thought leadership pieces, usually in collaboration with other design practices, so it's not just a one voice. One has to be quite careful because obviously dual aspect, fundamentally is quite a good thing, having a view in two directions, getting cross ventilation, but it does actually, comes at a price. It tends to drive typologies that are deck access or clustered around towers or houses, and none of those work particularly effectively for build-to-rent operators who are looking for kind of efficient layout, but also for community. Ironically, there's a standard that had a maximum of 8 apartments around a core on each floor, which was intended to sort of improve safety and community feeling. But obviously the build-to-rent world, we have a building in West London which has 42 flats around a core, works brilliantly, everybody comes through the same front entrance, shares the same facilities, and there's a great sense of community. So I think because it's still a relatively new sector, it still is taking on some policies that are established for different reasons. We just have to keep sort of delivering good quality buildings, taking the policy writers back to those buildings and saying, well, look, this is what we did, this is why we did it in this way. Is there perhaps an alternative policy or a second layer of policy that complements the fundamentals for the sector? I think there's plenty of guidance that's been written by ourselves and other like-minded practices out there. We just need to start delivering that on site and showing the policy writers that it still works.
That makes sense. Polly, I don't know if you wanted to add something to
Shall
the...
we try? It's working. Yeah, there we go. I think that absolutely. I think one of the challenges from the developers, Tom, you probably face is understanding exactly what those investor requirements are when you're bringing forward a build-to-rent development, because they're not the same. And that's one of the things I love about the sector is that we've seen a huge market segmentation around product and design, but also that different things work in different locations, and that we can be quite specific to the tenant base. And that's probably different from moving on from an energy strategy approach talking about ESG, because I think everybody is broadly in the same camp when it comes to ESG. Everybody wants to know what the energy strategy is, but also, and I've heard the conversation move a lot to talk about the use of materials and recycling of materials from on site, which never really featured in much conversation, go back 2 or 3 years. But talking about units around a core, fire safety, various different integration of community. It isn't the same from one investor to investor or one location to another, which makes our collective jobs difficult, but also a bit more interesting, I think.
Yeah, no, sure. And then, I mean, you sort of touched on, various challenges, whether it's policy, whether it's cost. There's obviously the sort of wider macroeconomic issues in play. To what extent, and Polly, maybe come back to you first, which is, to what extent is that impacting capital's decision? Are they stripping out some of these elements because of cost, or are they saying, actually, we can be more specific and therefore we only want assets with this? Is it wider than that? What's in play at the moment from that perspective?
Yeah, the investment market's at an interesting point right now. I certainly don't see people cutting costs for the sake of sacrificing design principles for the ability to save costs. I mean, at points in the market when there is uncertainty, we saw it in the beginning of 2020 as well. There's always a flight to quality, and people have a long-term belief in the product that they're delivering for the tenant base that they're delivering for. And that's the kind of lovely thing about build-to-rent investors, is that they are here for a long term. So they might be underwriting investment horizon value crystallization points at 10 years. Well, actually, many of them are thinking much further into the future than that. And that design can really work hand in hand with making sure that those buildings are operating at 98% occupancy, and that tenants enjoy living there and have the community benefits from it. And certainly that's what we're still seeing as a commitment towards those kind of not state of the art, but good quality developments designed for that part of the market that they're targeted.
Fine. And then Sam, I guess from a Pension Insurance Corporation point of view, how have those economic challenges impacted you as a business?
I think the way to look at it is there's also an opportunity there. So I mentioned about heightening people's awareness of particularly utility costs is the easy one to mention, but it becomes an opportunity because if we can make efficient buildings, if you look at metering strategies, for example, and you set up a building such that you can procure energy as a group across the whole asset rather than each individual resident having to enter into a contract, then there's a point of differentiation there. And if we set up buildings in this energy efficient way, we can substantiate and communicate that, then actually there's a point of differentiation to the rest of the market. And I think the macroeconomic issues have kind of heightened that awareness and given us the opportunity to leverage what we're already doing and to sell that story to residents and make that a positive.
Yeah, sure. And I guess as technology is evolving, as thought leadership's evolving, this isn't going to be every building moving forward is going to tick every box and therefore be that in perpetuity. Obviously, there's going to be an evolution, which means buildings you're investing in now in 5 years might not tick the same boxes that you want now. How do we prevent that happening? Maybe so from a design perspective, is there a way, can we retrofit those buildings to bring them back to spec? Is it about, what do we do?
We rarely have the luxury in housing design of sort of building obsolescence. There's sort of long life loose fit. A building that's really kind of adaptable and flexible is rarely the case in housing. If your one bedroom flat is any more than 50 square metres, you're in trouble. But I think the build-to-rent sector has a slightly more relaxed view around some of the metrics, say net to gross, which has been obsessions in certain sectors of housing, private sector housing, of getting to that 80% if you can get there. And the build-to-rent sector saying, well, actually it's quite valuable for us to have a slightly wider corridor. That'll actually reduce our maintenance problem, but it'll also feel more generous, and we're actually not really building a lot more building. It's just a little bit more corridor on the floor. We've still got to have corridor walls. Things like the two staircase solution. It's not yet a policy to have two staircases. The HSE and the London Fire Brigade are trying pretty hard to bring it in by stealth, just sort of suggesting it might be a good idea or raising a concern. But actually the build-to-rent sector said, well, never mind that. We don't want the doubt. Most are now moving forward and saying, let's put two staircases in for taller buildings. So I think there's a degree to which they take a straightforward view. Limited cost of putting in a staircase now, a lot of cost to put it in later, a lot of disruption, a lot of difficulty. We don't want to diminish the value of our asset by not building it in from the start. As to sort of coming back and I suppose changing the layouts of the apartments or refitting, I think that's really straightforward. That's a really possible thing to do. And I imagine in a kind of generation 15, 20-year cycle, those apartments will be refitted. I doubt very much we'll be coming back and reconfiguring the buildings in a significant, in a fundamental way. But I guess there could be ways of subdividing 3-bedroom flats. Back to policy then, is that they're so determined and defined by a policy mix that you've had to work hard to get right. The chances of you being able to kind of get that approved later on, we'd have to wait and see.
Yeah, and then Sam, as a long-term holder, how do you foresee that working? Obviously, you're buying assets now. In 10 years, 15 years, there's probably going to be an internal refurb or remodelling, but from energy systems, fundamentals of actually ESG credential targets will no doubt have moved on.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we appreciate things move on. So we are long-term holders, and we fully appreciate that over time we will have to retrofit things and keep things up to standard. And then there's a whole feedback loop from residents as well. So the demands, as I said, because of the squeeze, some of it's coming from us, some of it's coming from resident demand. Once we've got residents in the buildings and we listen to what they want, then there's that feedback loop, which then means that all of those aspirations get taken and put into new buildings, but also retrofitted as and when is appropriate into the buildings that we have.
Yeah, fine. And then probably from a sort of capital perspective, there's, given the nascency of the sort of build-to-rent market, less opportunity now for that sort of retrofit. But do you see appetite out there from investors for, taking existing commercial buildings and moving them into build-to-rent, or do those institutions prefer to have a ground-up development and kind of know where they've started?
Well, there are some opportunities for retrofitting. Certainly some of the original, we can call them maybe Gen 0, -1 build-to-rent assets that pretty much were accidental build-to-rent assets coming out of the end of end of the downturn through receivership, and they probably could are undergoing programmatic refurbishment, and so we're seeing, not necessarily seeing them wholesale, but certainly there are the odd opportunity out there. In the future, the office to resi conversation has never really attracted a whole host of institutional investment, and largely because I think that was maybe not done as the highest level or quality of design early on, so it's got a somewhat of a negative reputation, but certainly I think if there's there are some great examples of where that has worked, and investors have been able to again demonstrate that reusing buildings that are already there but maybe enjoyed a previous life, which is a little bit more illustrious and of times gone by, could definitely support the delivery of good quality housing in the future. There's probably a whole host of opportunities, although I would say that the majority of demand that we see now are some of the buildings that we've spoken about today that have been ground up, start from scratch approach.
I think it's inevitable, isn't it? I don't know if anyone's followed the row over Marks and Spencer at Oxford Street. It started, I think, as a slightly niche architect's journal. How dare they tear down a building to put up another building? And the headlines in the architect's journal start things like, architect to flatten building and build another one, sort of thing. It's just it's quite emotive, and there's a whole campaign. Strange for a journal which is supposed to celebrate architecture, and that's actually grown into quite a national campaign now. And there's all sorts of celebrities have weighed in and said how dare they demolish a building. That's not put up for housing, but you can imagine that buildings like that will suddenly find that you're not able to just demolish them. It's just not going to be acceptable, and if they're not suitable for other uses, then they generally default to housing if you can't find an alternative use. And there are some fantastic examples, Tom, one near a place that's close to our heart, the Hoover building on the A40. Who would have thought that would be converted to luxury housing? But it has, and it's very successful. So there are some great examples, and I'm sure we'll see more of it. And then there'll be a whole sector emerging to really specialise, I think, in that type of delivery.
Perfect, no, thank you. Just conscious of time, I think we've almost gone through key stakeholders. So capital appear to be on board, design, architects on board, professional consultants, residents, operators. A key party is probably the contractor and getting them on board with delivering these schemes. Simon, is there a real challenge out there with contractors? I think one subject is kind of airtightness, and if we really want to move to more kind of passive systems, that's a fundamental. Are there other challenges, considerations with contractors?
Well, I think quality on site is incredibly difficult. There's a challenge in the workforce at the moment, and getting people to turn up can be quite difficult, never mind to turn up and do a good job.
Yeah.
If they can finish the job, that's a start. If they can finish it well and then test it. I mean, there is a layering of standards which is very difficult. I've talked a bit about the challenges between overheating and daylight and sunlight, but there's quite a lot in the building fabric that's quite difficult to get right. I talked about modular construction and factory-made housing and modules and pods and things like that, and even facades can help to bring down the kind of the gaps. We have a saying, there is a saying, which is if you want to avoid gaps in your building, you need to avoid gaps in your procurement process.
Yes.
And so putting that responsibility in one place. Many years ago when we did the Bristol scheme, I talked about zero carbon community. They subcontracted the whole of the envelope to one organisation. They made the walls, the timber frame panels, and they supplied the windows, and they were responsible for testing it. So they got it right, and they got less than one on the first house, and they improved it throughout.
Yeah.
So the industry can do it. The industry is perfectly capable. It has the skills and the abilities. It just needs to be organised and procured properly. I think there's a huge responsibility on the developer and on the the sort of the capital side to ensure that it's putting the responsibility where it can be properly discharged. Giving someone the responsibility without the ability and the tools and the mechanisms to fully discharge it won't achieve it. But it's definitely doable.
Yeah.
Tom, we haven't heard from a developer.
Right, great.
What do you think?
I mean, us as a business, we're sort of ESG is at the forefront. We're pushing all the avenues, obviously working with capital, we're working with design, operators, etc. I think one of the biggest challenges for us is actually the contractor piece and how we really sort of excite them and get them on board in order to deliver what we all collectively want to achieve. I think the one solution, and I'll pass back to you both now, that would solve it for everyone is actually paying more for the assets, alleviating that pressure, and therefore, if we as a developer or as Simon as a professional consultant or the contractor put all these elements into a building and truly create something that is great from an energy efficiency perspective, is there value to be had, and is capital willing to pay it? One of you two, over back to you.
You want to go first, Alan? You heard it here first.
Well, partly it comes back to the rents, doesn't it? And it comes back to whether residents are accepting of that. And that's a hard one because we're pushing boundaries in build to rent already. So there's a challenge there. There is a challenge. But I don't think there's a challenge from the point of view of desire. I think desire's there, but it's always going to be harder to try and push the boundaries when it comes to paying more money.
Yeah, sure. And Polly, green premium, is that a thing?
Green premium, yes, but I think there's also across the capital stack. There's one way of looking at it, which is putting that cost onto the tenant. But there are other ways and other sources of return requirements. So we've seen some green funds and green bonds being issued and stuff that are cheaper. And I think that can really support. So we've some investors in the space have physically paid an uplift to upgrade from a gas boiler system in a single family asset to air source heat pumps, and that's because they had access to green money, which could only be used for that. And I think that whilst we're starting to see that infiltrate the sector, it's probably not it's probably not there the modus operandi at the moment. Of course, I think we've made the point about future liquidity and the value that paying something a small amount now to future-proof your asset can have. And I think that needs to be as part of the investment thesis as to, when bringing forward new developments for build to rent, and the fact that the sector has the ability to do that in a way that open market sale product maybe doesn't.
No, brilliant. Thanks, Polly. Conscious of a couple of minutes left. I don't know, audience, any questions from your side at all for the panel?
We answered everything.
There we go. There we go. Well, in that case, thank you very much, and thanks to the panel.